On a beautiful Tuesday morning, Zimbabweans woke up to some shocking news on their main television channel that said,
"The situation in our country has moved to another level."
The military had taken over the state in an operation it called Operation Restore Legacy, ending a 37-year-long tenure of one who was the oldest president in the world at the time, Robert Mugabe, who had been president of the nation since 1980. The issue of whether it was a coup d'etat or it was simply the military carrying out its duties remains controversial, mainly because of the way it was carried out.
It does sound like a coup, but it is not a coup.
You see, unlike many others which result in the assassination of the president, a complete lockdown of the streets, or even the killing of the citizens themselves, this was one of its own kind, as citizens were allowed into the central business district of Zimbabwe's capital city of Harare, being used as a tool by the masterminds of this plot to show their discontent and hate of the president. Now, I have realized that when most people analyze the rule of Robert Mugabe, they either come up with an argument that seeks to criticize his rule and all the decisions that his government made, without actually looking at the underlying factors that led to the making of those decisions, or another breed that only takes a reverent position when they look at his tenure, deciding only to look at the good that he did, but not the bad that he did. But from my own point of view, this is a mischaracterization of his time as president. Which is the reason why in this video I'll try to look at both the good and the bad that Mugabe and his adversaries did, so that you come up with a conclusion of your own, whether you regard him as an accomplished leader or otherwise as another failed African intellectual, as a hero or as a villain. On February the 21st, 1924, in a rural town of Kutama, a carpenter by the name Gabriel Matibiri and a Christian catechist gave birth to a son, the son who would become known as Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe was the third out of his parents' 6 children. After completing 6 years of elementary school, Mugabe was offered a place for a teacher's training program at Kutama College. Mugabe left Kutama College in 1945 and taught in several schools around Rhodesia, and in 1949 he won a scholarship to study at Fort Hare University in South Africa, where he studied until 1951, graduating with a bachelor's degree in history and English literature. Whilst at Fort Hare, he got introduced to Marxist ideas. Marxism is in simple terms a social, economic and political philosophy named after Karl Marx. It examines the effect of capitalism on labor, productivity and economic development, that argues for a worker revolution to overturn capitalism in favor of communism. But as Mugabe described it, despite his exposure to Marxism, his biggest influence came from Mahatma Gandhi's actions during the Indian independence movement. He also described his time at Fort Hare as a turning point of his life. In the early 1950s, Mugabe was not active in any political movement. He did join a number of interracial groups. In 1954, he earned a bachelor's degree in education by correspondence from the University of South Africa while teaching in Zimbabwe, which was then Southern Rhodesia. He later relocated to Northern Rhodesia, which is the present-day Zambia, where he worked between 1955 and 1958. There he earned his second bachelor's degree by correspondence from the University of London. In 1958, Mugabe moved to Ghana, where he worked at St. Mary's Teachers Training College. It's during his time in Ghana where he met his first wife, Sally Hyperinflation. Reflecting on his time in Ghana, Mugabe said, and I quote, "I went to Ghana as an adventurist to see what it would be like in an independent African state." Ghana was under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah at the time, and Mugabe attended Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute. Mugabe later claimed that it was in Ghana where he fully embraced Marxism, and this proved to be the real turning point of his life and career. Following his return to Southern Rhodesia in 1960, Mugabe quickly gained popularity with the help of a respectable profession, coupled with the possession of 3 degrees in various fields of study. He joined the National Democratic Party, which was popularly known as the NDP. The party was led by Joshua Nkomo, and Mugabe joined the party as the head of publicity. NDP was a nationalist party which opposed the brutal rule of the white minority, which deprived black people of the same rights as the minor white population in the then British colony of Southern Rhodesia. After the banning of the National Democratic Party in December of 1961, just several days later, many of the former NDP members would reorganize to form the Zimbabwean African People's Union, abbreviated as ZAPU, with Mugabe being appointed secretary of the new party. ZAPU would soon be banned by the Rhodesian government due to its opposition of the white supremacist laws which were enacted by the Rhodesian government. However, the oppressed black minority would put up another great show of resilience, as in August 1962 they formed the Zimbabwean African National Union, with Ndabaningi Stole as the party president and Mugabe as the secretary general in absentia, while he had gone to drop off his newborn son and wife in Ghana for their safety. Upon returning to Rhodesia, Mugabe was arrested and was sentenced for 10 years in prison. During his time in prison, Mugabe devoted his time to reading and studying and left prison with law degrees. Whilst in prison, Mugabe remained popular among ZANU supporters, with some of them supporting him as a party leader instead of the incumbent Ndabaningi Stole. Following his release from prison, Mugabe fled to Mozambique where he led the guerrilla war against the colonial government, with the help in the form of funding, weapons and military training from China and other communist nations. Neighboring countries that had gained independence also played a significant role in providing hideouts and sabotaging trade with the Rhodesian government. It's also important to note that Southern Rhodesia had unilaterally declared itself independent of Britain. Therefore, they received no support in their fight against the armed military wings of ZANU and ZAPU, which were ZANLA and ZIPRA respectively. More on the unilateral declaration of independence later. The Rhodesian Prime Minister at the time, Ian Smith, received military support from the neighboring South Africa, but it wasn't enough to end the war, as ZANLA and ZIPRA have the support of rural peasants who played a pivotal role in the war. And the reason for this was because the two parties had committed themselves to radical land reform policies once they won the war. Following his failure to end the war, the Rhodesian Prime Minister called for negotiations with Mugabe and other influential figures leading the war against the colonial government. In 1979, an agreement was reached between both parties which allowed free and fair elections, with equal voting rights between the black and the white populations. An election would be held the following year, which Mugabe won with a resounding victory.
Mr. Mugabe's landslide victory here, with a total of 57 of the 100 seats, has left Rhodesia's white population fearful.
Now, pay very close attention here. When people talk about Mugabe's failure as a leader, they often hone in on the violent land expropriation of 2002, but they miss the point. Now let me take you back to something that I introduced earlier in the video, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, most commonly referred to as the UDI. Now, it's also worth noting that since its establishment in 1923, following an annexation from the British South Africa Company by Britain, Southern Rhodesia had its own government. A little over 4 decades down the line, white Rhodesians felt that it was time to declare themselves as an independent sovereign state. It would become the only British colony to ever declare itself independent since the United States did so in 1776. This did not amuse Britain, which went on to declare this declaration illegal. The Commonwealth, the United Nations and Britain would impose sanctions on Rhodesia, leading to the expulsion of Rhodesia from the Sterling area, which meant that Southern Rhodesia was not allowed to use the British pound anymore. A ban on the import of Rhodesian sugar, tobacco, chrome and other goods, and an oil boycott of Rhodesia. Being a landlocked country, Rhodesia relied heavily on Mozambique for its access to the sea. The British government attempted to directly cut off their main supply lines, mainly the Mozambican ports at Beira and Lorenzo Marques, by posting a Royal Navy squadron to the Mozambique Channel in March 1966. This blockade, known as the Beira Patrol, was endorsed the following month by the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations proceeded to institute its first mandatory trade sanctions in history in the late 1960s, which required member states to cease all trade and economic links with Rhodesia. With no trade and an internal conflict, the Rhodesian Bush War, the Rhodesian economy had already begun to slow down and unemployment skyrocketed amongst the black people. The black community relied heavily on farming, and with more and more whites venturing into farming, this meant more competition for the black farmer who received little to no support at all from the government. Now, at the time when these sanctions were lifted following agreements at the Lancaster House Conference between the nationalist parties and Ian Smith's government, and thereafter the 1980 presidential elections, the white population alone provided much of Rhodesia's skilled labor in most of the important industries. Following Mugabe's victory, some of the most skilled labor force fled to countries like Australia, South Africa and Britain. Out of 250,000 white Rhodesians, only 100,000 were left in 6 years of independence. This begs the question, why did more than half of the white Rhodesian population flee Zimbabwe? See, in the early years of independence, there were incidents of violence against white farm owners. There was a lot of uncertainty regarding the policies that were to be enacted by the new government. In 1983, a component of the army called the 5th Brigade sought to find armed dissidents who belonged to the parties that had fought the Rhodesian Bush War, but whose parties did not win the 1980 presidential election. Now, it is argued that the whole purpose of this operation was to annihilate any prospect of opposition against the incumbent government. A search for 400 dissidents ended up leading to the loss of 20,000 lives. See, there are two major tribal groups in Zimbabwe, the Ndebele tribe, which accounts for about 20% of the Zimbabwean population, and the Shona tribe, which accounts for about 70% of the population, with other groups making up the rest of the population. It is worth noting that these groups have had a history of conflict long before the colonization of Zimbabwe. It also happened that most of these targeted persons were from the second major tribe of Zimbabwe, the Ndebele tribe. The fact that the Zimbabwean army was used to neutralize possible uprisings from former ZIPRO fighters explains why there was fear amongst the white Zimbabwean community during the early days of independence. One would be justified to think that it was a tribal issue rather than suffocation of possible opposition. Now, one would also be tempted to think that if tribal elimination was possible, elimination based on race was also possible. Taking into account all these tribal tensions, it makes sense that the fear of an uprising might have motivated the mass human slaughter, which in turn motivated a mass immigration of the skilled labor force of Zimbabwe. Furthermore, by 1980, when the majority rule was finally achieved, private companies were badly in need of new investment because much plant and machinery had become obsolete.
In opening this conference, I expressed the hope that we would be able to lay the foundations for a free, independent and democratic society in which all the people of Rhodesia, irrespective of their race or political beliefs, would be able to live in security and peace with each other and with their neighbors.
The Lancaster House Agreement, signed in 1979 following several attempts at reaching an agreement that would see the majority have equal rights to the white settler. This agreement would revoke the UDI as well as calling a ceasefire to the Rhodesian Bush War. British control over Rhodesia would be strictly proscribed to the duration of the proposed election period. One major concern during the negotiations was the issue of land redistribution, as most black people in Rhodesia were displaced from fertile land and were made occupants of less arable land that received lower rainfall compared to where they had been settled for centuries. One of the primary motivations for the nationalist parties forming military wings was the land issue. Paraphrasing Mugabe, the land question was at the center of the factors that propelled us to launch our war of liberation. As such, ex-combatants, better known as war veterans, were expecting the new government prospects to deliver on their promise of, quote, a radical land reform once they took office. But to their disbelief, no such agreement was made, or at least to the extent that they expected. Earlier in the 1970s, an agreement was reached, an agreement that led to the formation of the Zimbabwe Development Fund, to which Britain agreed to contribute at least £75 million, an idea which was hugely welcomed by the ZANU-ZAP coalition. The new British government, led by Margaret Thatcher, denied any association to the agreement when the concerned parties sat down to hammer out an independent constitution, and would say that the Zimbabwean government would not touch the white-owned land for a period of 10 years, terms which Mugabe and his colleagues refused. Instead, the British government made a compromise and pledged to pay £500 million for resettling the native Zimbabweans who had been taken to the so-called protective villages, and over 1/5 of the population which had fled their homes during the plight of the war. The American president at the time made a similar offer. Purchasing of the resettlement land was to be done on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. In a desperate capitulation to the hands of the British, Mugabe and his nationalist colleagues accepted the stipulated terms. The agreement, however, was only valid for 10 years and expired in 1990. Following an election to power of the British Labour Party, Minister for International Development Claire Short wrote to the Zimbabwean government stating that "We do not accept that Britain has a special responsibility to meet the costs of land purchase in Zimbabwe." Following yet another change of government in Britain in the year 1997. Now, due to the support that the white farmer had received at the expense of black farmers, as well as the fact that black farmers were settled on less arable land, 90% of local food requirements was being met by the white farmers. In the early 1990s, following an expiration of the Lancaster House Agreement, Mugabe's government was faced with a dilemma: chase the white farmers who have more expertise, which would have a negative impact on the economy, or leave the issue unresolved and risk uncontrollable national protests or even uprising from war veterans. As such, a new policy was drafted which would allow the government to acquire land from any white farmer after a fair compensation. The same land was going to be used to resettle millions of Zimbabweans on more fertile land. The conflict over land was mostly fueled by the growing tension between the government of Zimbabwe and the ex-combatants who felt neglected by the government. To seize the tension, Mugabe announced a package for war veterans that included a once-off payment of 50,000 Zimbabwean dollars, an equivalent of $3,000 at the time, and a monthly allowance of 2,000 Zimbabwean dollars, which translated to $125. It is alleged that to meet this promise, the Zimbabwean government had to print money, adding more fuel to the already growing inflation. During the first 2 decades into independence, the Zimbabwean economy was on a downward trajectory due to different factors that I mentioned earlier in the video, like lack of skilled labor in the early years of independence and lack of modern industrial equipment. Adding to this list was heavy borrowing from the international community by the Zimbabwean government. Smallholder farmers were also afforded loans by the government, but due to their lack of expertise in farming, they inevitably defaulted on the payment of the loans, further sending the economy on a downward spiral. August 1998, a war broke in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The war ended in 2003. It involved 9 African nations, and among those nations was a nation 1,848 kilometers south of Congo. This nation was Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwean government spent heavily on helping the Democratic Republic of Congo fight against terrorism. This supposed incompetence of the Zimbabwean government would lead to the formation of the MDC party. The MDC party was the first real threat to Mugabe's government and drew a lot of sponsorship from the farming and business communities. With the growth in popularity of the MDC party, Mugabe felt that he would lose support by not delivering on his promise of returning land to its rightful owners.
Whoever gets disappointed, we will not share the blame for that.
He also received a wake-up call when the majority of voters voted against a constitutional amendment that would see Mugabe have more power than he had before.
Those farmers who are planning violence, please listen to this message. We can unleash greater violence than they.
It's late 2000. The Zimbabwean parliament, whose majority was ZANU-PF, passes a bill that would allow the government to seize land with no compensation. Thousands of white farmers were evicted from their farms. Any sign of resistance would be met by violence by the occupants. Huge expanses of fertile land were occupied by people with no knowledge of farming. A significant chunk would go into the hands of the senior government officials and not to the people who were in desperate need of the land.
No long-term planning for that land reform. Some of the land stock that is in the government hands has ended up within senior government officials and ministers. the people who need the land have been totally excluded.
It is argued by many that Mugabe used land expropriation in a desperate attempt to counter his loss of support by pleasing many Zimbabweans who were in desperate need of fertile land. In response to this, the United States enacted the Zedera Act of 2001, which prevents the United States from voting in support of new assistance to Zimbabwe from international financial institutions, and later on the Targeted Sanctions Program, which targeted individuals involved in human rights abuse or any form of illegal activity that affects the livelihood of Zimbabwean citizens. In 2008, Zimbabwe recorded the second highest incidence of hyperinflation, with a daily inflation rate of 98%. This is the second highest ever daily inflation, only falling behind the hyperinflation that occurred in Hungary in 1946. Some of the causes of this are attributed to the alleged printing of money by Mugabe's government to sponsor the DRC war that I mentioned before, and compensation of the war veterans. To curb the inflation, the Zimbabwean government legalized the transactional use of the United States dollar, the British pound, the South African rand, and the Botswana pula. The introduction of a multi-currency economy helped ease the effects of inflation and improve the livelihood of an average Zimbabwean. Not so long after the hyperinflation was also the formation of an inclusive government, in which there was a sharing of power between the major political parties. The inclusive government would only exist until the 2018 general elections of Zimbabwe. November 2017. Zimbabweans take to the streets after the army had seized the state, an event that saw Robert Mugabe resign from his position as the president of the nation. He was succeeded by his former ally, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who became the second president of the republic under the new constitution. Mugabe passed away on the 9th of September 2019. At the time of his death, Mugabe was staying with his family in Singapore. He was buried in his home country of Zimbabwe.